Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of our culture. Warm thanks to LOA members and to all of you attending tonight for supporting our work and these LOA Live programs. Tonight's program marks publication of a new edition of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, volume number 389 in the Library of America series, co-edited by Thomas Wild, who joins us tonight, and the late Jerome Cohn, to whom tonight's program is dedicated. This is the first annotated edition of Arendt's great work and includes recovered chapters and other writings that trace the development of her thought on authoritarian regimes. It is published with support from the Achilles and Bodman Foundation. The rise of totalitarian governments, Arendt wrote in 1954, is the central event of our world. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, she examines the horrors of Nazism and Stalinism as twin manifestations of a terrifying new political form that sought absolute domination over all aspects of life. Bringing to bear history, sociology, political science, psychology, and philosophy, Arendt's masterpiece is astonishingly erudite, brilliantly perceptive, and charged with fierce moral force. It sets itself a daunting task: to understand how it's possible for regimes of terror to arise that enlist willing subjects in their monstrously oppressive systems. Subjects for whom, Arendt writes, the distinction between fact and fiction and between true and false no longer exists. People shaped for acquiescence by a modern condition she calls loneliness, a loss of faith in human community and creativity, the experience, she writes, of not belonging to the world at all, which is among the most radical and desperate experiences of man. What is totalitarianism? How does it work, and to what ends? What makes people and societies susceptible? How does Arendt's book speak to our contemporary global political landscape? To explore these and other questions, we're joined by a very distinguished panel. Seyla Benhabib is Eugene Meyer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy Emerita at Yale University and Senior Research Fellow and Adjunct Professor of Law at Columbia University. Her many books include The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt and, as editor, Politics in Dark Times, Encounters with Hannah Arendt. She joins us from her home in New York City. David Bromwich is Sterling Professor of English at Yale University. His books include How Words Make Things Happen and American Breakdown, The Trump Years and How They Befell Us. His writing on contemporary politics and the fate of civil liberties in the United States has appeared in The Nation, the New York Review of Books, and the London Review of Books, and includes his introduction to On Lying and Politics for Library of America. He joins us from his home in North Haven, Connecticut. Thomas Wild, co-editor of the Arendt edition, is Professor of German Studies and Literature at Bard College. He is author of Hannah Arendt, Leben, Werk, Wirkung, and general editor of the critical edition of the complete works of Hannah Arendt. He joins us from Bard College in upstate New York. Our moderator, Roger Berkowitz, is Professor of Political Studies and Human Rights and Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, one of our promotional partners for tonight's program. Roger contributed the introduction to the Library of America publication on civil disobedience. And I should mention that he hosts a podcast that's available at the Hannah Arendt Center, which reads Origins of Totalitarianism chapter by chapter. For those of you looking for a podcast companion to the Library of America edition, I think that's the ideal one. Roger joins us from his home in New York. We welcome your questions and comments and invite you to share your name and where you're viewing from. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Now please welcome Seyla Benhabib, David Bromwich, Thomas Wild, and Roger Berkowitz. Roger, over to you.
Thank you very much, Max, and it's great to be here with my friends and colleagues, Seyla, David, and Thomas. Just a quick note, the podcast Reading Hannah Arendt with Roger Berkowitz is available at any podcast program. You can just find it. And we do have a chapter by chapter reading of this book. So if you're interested, it's a good way to accompany your way through it. I thought I'd begin by asking Thomas Wild, who edited this this new edition, this new annotated edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism with our friend and recently deceased Jerry Cohn, how this edition came about and what the principles of the edition are and what makes it distinct from other earlier editions of The Origins of Totalitarianism. Tomas?
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, I would like to extend my thanks to the Library of America to welcome Hannah Arendt in this wonderful book series, and would like to thank Max Rudin for the program tonight, and John Kolka, Jim Gibbons, and Brian McCarthy for working with Jerry Cohn and myself on this edition. An edition that is planned to have 5 volumes. The Origins of Totalitarianism that we are looking at today is the first one. And we are very pleased to have been able to come up, I think, with a really exciting selection of texts for these 5 books. You mentioned already, Roger, Jerome Cohn, the co-editor, my co-editor of this book, who passed away in November of 2024 last year. And as many of you might know, studied with Hannah Arendt at the New School, worked as her teaching assistant, and really dedicated his life to her legacy. Many of the books that we have and can read Arendt's texts from her papers have been edited by Jerome Cohn. And I'm sure that the fact that the Library of Congress about 3 years ago approached Jerry Cohn and myself about this series for the Library of America has also to do with the way in which Jerome Cohn has shaped our understanding of Arendt's work over the past decades. So in a way, this evening is also dedicated to his legacy as an editor and trustee of the Arendt Blücher Trust. Now, what is special about this edition of the Origins of Totalitarianism? This really has to be seen in the context of these 5 volumes, and we have looked to make each volume that is planned somehow special. We know that the Library of America republishes major works, and but also we wanted to give it something special and make each volume special, and there will be a surprise and an enhancement in each of these volumes. For the Origins of Totalitarianism, we have decided to give the readers, first of all, the definitive text, as it were, that Arendt authorized in 1967, the last edition, but also give the readers 2 texts that have been part of earlier editions of the Origins, and those are so-called concluding remarks. They were the final chapter of the very first edition, and then a text that is called Reflections on the Hungarian Revolution that Arendt included in a later edition in 1958. So now we really have, let's say, all the texts in the versions through which these Origins, which is now a canonical work, have gone through. And when we consulted with colleagues about these ideas, several colleagues of us have been excited that this would be a great copy also to use in teaching, because it includes all of these texts together. That's maybe the basics about this volume. And I should mention that in addition to Hannah Arendt's own annotations and footnotes, there is an apparatus with explanatory notes about facts, about contexts that the Library of America thought would be helpful for their reader, in addition to Hannah Arendt's own footnotes. And last but not least, there's a chronology that will be available in all of the volumes. It is typical for the Library of America. And this same chronology will be in all of the 5 volumes. Jerry and I worked on that this past summer. So in this way, his work will also be present in the volumes to come.
Thank you very much, Tomas. And I think it's important to say that the Reflections on the Hungarian Revolution is is a text that I find many people want to read, and I'm always emailed and people asking, where can I find this text? It's not as easily available as some of her other texts. And so I think it's great that you've included it here. Seyla, I wanted to turn to you. The question that the Library of America has asked us to think of it today was what is totalitarianism? It's a hard question to answer. I'm not sure if you think Arendt gives an answer to it. I mean, the book was originally called The Elements of Totalitarian Domination, at least in her thinking. Is there an answer to the question, what is totalitarianism, Seyla, and how would you begin to think about that?
Good evening. Nice to be here with colleagues and friends. Thank you to the Library of America. I have a tattered volume here that is even lacking a final page. Arendt called the book was first published, as we know, in the UK as The Burden of Our Times. And then she called it The Elements of Totalitarian Domination, in German Elemente totalitäre Herrschaft. So to begin to answer this, I will single out 6 elements, and then I'll say something about the word elements and Arendt's caution about it. Arendt was not trying to build a general theory of totalitarianism, nor was she writing a philosophy of history, which said that from Plato to Nietzsche, sort of Western history produced totalitarianism. She resisted both these temptations greatly, and so she singled out several elements which were there in different historical and geographic contexts, but which she claimed came together to form a new form, an unprecedented form of government and political experience in human history. The first element, which I think is common to both totalitarianism and autocratic regimes, is the principle of the personality of the leader. That all these forms of government depend upon the existence of some kind of charismatic personality who unifies or brings together this movement, and usually it's a he, under his power. So there is the cult of the leader. The second aspect, which is more true of the experiences of National Socialism and Stalinism, is that the party, which is a mass organization of followers, is transformed. The party is transformed, and there's something to keep in mind, into basically an organization that manifests the will of the leader and the cult of the leader. In other words, what Arendt is saying is that parties under totalitarianism do not necessarily begin at the beginning. They participate even in quasi-democratic processes. I mean, so did National Socialist Party even participate in the Weimar elections, as we know. But the party transforms itself. It transforms itself in that the opposition is quashed and it becomes an instrument of the leader. The third factor is the element of propaganda, or what we might call today in our societies post-truth, or the elimination of the distinction between truth and falsehood. I mean, reading Arendt on propaganda, you can see how much she anticipates, or how much has come to pass in our mediatic age. And in fact, the chief goal of propaganda is to create a world that coheres with the dominant ideology of the party and the leader. What propaganda wants is to eliminate incongruities or disharmonies that somehow do not come all together with this general worldview that is being projected, and if in the process the truth must be sacrificed, so be it. I mean, this has very interesting analogies to the present, because propaganda in these regimes also competes with science. And this may, for American ears, this may sound completely strange, but there were things called Soviet genetics, Soviet linguistics, just as there was a Nazi science, a Nazi legal science, which tried to purify itself, quote unquote, of Jewish cosmopolitan elements. So this tension between propaganda and science. So this brings me to the fourth element, which is, again, extremely significant. She says totalitarianism is about lawful lawlessness, a contradictory phrase. Totalitarian governments have their own forms of law, and they don't necessarily eliminate law-giving institutions altogether either. But what does lawful lawlessness mean? Lawful lawlessness means, I'll be very brief about this, that basically positive law as it is promulgated, subordinates itself to a higher law. Now, this higher law in the case of National Socialism was the race theory and the greatness of the Nazi folk, etc. In the case of Stalinist Russia, it's an equal understanding of what serves the Soviet people. But the opposition and resistance in these regimes is not just eliminated arbitrarily the way a tyrant would. There is a kind of method in the madness of using the law to eliminate the opposition. Lawfulness. Again, there is a lot to be said about this. The last 2 points, and this is the heart of her analysis in the famous chapter on ideology and terror. Camps, the building of the camps. And Arendt here proves pathetic, because the 20th century builds camps. Governments build camps, and these are not all obviously extermination camps. They can be labor camps. They can be detention camps. But there is a tendency in somehow in these regimes, and I don't want to follow, let's say, Giorgio Agamben and say this is a manifestation of 20th century biopolitics or something. Forgive me if the reference is a bit obscure, but we have to think about this. We have to think about this as our government is building now camps and has retained camps for the last 2 decades, spotting Texas, but the Mexico-US border. Why? What are the camps for? In the case of totalitarian regimes, of course, camps were for elimination. In the case of autocratic regimes, camps would be to instill fear and to make sort of opposition elements go quiet. Final point, and is her claim that these forms of government survive on war, that sooner or later totalitarian governments lead to war with their neighbors, lead to confrontation, lead to a form or aspire to a form of world domination. So I will stop there, and I think that the echoes of all these elements for our times are hard to miss.
Thank you very much, Seyla. It's a big book. There's 3 parts of the book that we should say. The first part is on anti-Semitism. The second part is on imperialism, and then the third part is on totalitarianism. And Seyla has, I think, very much, given us 6 of these core elements of what Arendt understands totalitarianism to be. David, I'm wondering, do you want to add to that? How do you look at this question of totalitarianism and Arendt? Do you come at it in the same way? Do you see similar elements, others?
Well, I would say that the major thing to keep in mind is that under totalitarian rule, politics and society are merged. There is nothing of social life that is not in some way controlled by the state, by political guidance, political soft or hard coercion. It may have been an element of Arendt's diagnosis, but I think it's not the most essential or even maybe a necessary one, that the personality of the leader dominate in some mythic imaged way in totalitarianism. It is the control and the instilling of habits of obedience to control that matters most. We have 2 novels of the mid-century that are often taken to be illustrations of what totalitarian social existence might be. There's Orwell's 1984, where you have Big Brother as the state, but Big Brother is such a shiftable entity that there's no sense that people are drawn to a charismatic character. There's nothing charismatic about Big Brother. And then the idea of a state that is the Big Brother matters more than anything about a face or gestures. And then there is Huxley's Brave New World. And there, the state is almost invisible because people have been successfully cowed and brought into line by being drugged and habituated to certain ways of doing things. So that total organization of society, initially by political means, but eventually just by habit, seems to me the essential fact. And what Arendt asks us to understand is that this is a phenomenon of mass society. It can't happen in a small town where people know each other. And one of its preconditions is that people not know each other very well or have become somehow alienated, dispersed, isolated from each other. Rather than any of the political present-day symptoms that Seyla Benhabib cited, I would ask people to think about what it's like walking on a street where you see half of your fellows on the street looking into their gizmos, not talking to each other. And this happens, even in lunch lines at my university. That's a kind of isolation that's a very nice precondition for a heavily, managed rule of people's habits. And it's part of the way the advanced world is teaching all of the world to exist right now. I think it's scary. It's scary than more scary than any other single personality. And Arendt gives a clue to why it deprives us of the equipment for resistance, dissent, the dialogue with ourselves, which he always insists is the the highest and most to be aimed for thing in human nature. So, let me just add, to use another one of her words, action with purpose is so important to human dignity as she understands it. And under totalitarian rule, all action becomes mere behavior. Docility becomes the prime civic virtue. But there's always an underlying fear. The fear can be completely internalized so that it's almost unconscious, but it emerges, or rather it is manifested in traits that indicate caution, deference to authority, a very careful, friendly distance from neighbors. And the other fact about the state now, not society, I suppose, just to emphasize, anyone who knows anything about Arendt or the argument of the book will know this, but the duty to the state supersedes all other maxims of conduct in a totalitarian government. And that's true of Nazi Germany as well as Stalin's Russia, her 2 main examples. So those are just some afterthoughts to add to the picture that's already been given.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think, something that both of you have focused on, and I think David touched on a little bit right there, is for Arendt, to the extent she ever does give a definition of totalitarianism, it's the most radical elimination of human freedom and spontaneity. A government based on the most radical elimination of freedom and spontaneity. And that's why the camps were so important to her, as Seyla pointed out, because she saw the camps as an experiment in which you could actually produce human corpses. People who would, in these camps, be so broken from their moral, legal, and personal identities that they would basically become like dogs or animals, Pavlovian dogs or animals, and just obey, as David was saying, complete loss of action. And that's the goal of totalitarianism as a novel form of government that she imagines. There's a first question that I have, and all three of you maybe can touch on it if you want. But maybe I'll start with Seyla. It's a question from Eric Beckstrom in Bloomington, Indiana. What are the distinctions or overlaps between totalitarianism, fascism, and authoritarianism? You mentioned that a little bit in your answer, Seyla, but can you, I mean, Arendt does talk about fascism as distinct from totalitarianism at times, and she talks about authoritarianism as an overarching idea. Can you lay out some of those distinctions for us?
I'll try.
And if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free.
Yeah. I think that fascism probably is best explained also in terms of a good point that David brought up, namely the distinction between political and civil society. Fascism, for Arendt, as exemplified by Mussolini's Italy, and of course, subsequently Franco's Spain, which we haven't, which she doesn't really talk about much, are regimes in which there is party domination. There is the leadership cult, about which David and I may disagree a bit, but the goal of these parties is not the total elimination of the distinction between civil society and the state. It's obedience, basically, to the state and upholding of the interests of the regime. And fascist regimes can survive quite a long time, just as Franco's Spain did, because they don't seek total domination. They are not as dynamic and as aggressive as totalitarian regimes. Now, authoritarianism does not suggest, again, the total control of the political apparatus. I mean, today in political science, we even talk about competitive authoritarianisms. Let's take the case of Erdogan's Turkey, maybe to a lesser extent, Orban's Hungary, where there's even a quasi-functioning multi-party system. Elections are not eliminated. There is some kind of a competition in the political sphere, but there are limits. There are limits set on the media, on the freedom of the press, on the freedom, academic freedom, freedom of universities. Institutions are more or less all, they know how far they can go. But unlike in totalitarianism, they are not totally merged with the system. I think that's the best I can do right now with that.
Yeah. Sure. Can I just ask a follow-up? I mean, one of the ways that I think Arendt sometimes distinguishes fascism and totalitarianism or totalitarianism from both fascism and authoritarianism is that in authoritarianism and fascism, you can still live freely in private life and sometimes even in society, whereas in totalitarianism, there's an attempt to even get inside your head and your house and dominate all your thinking. Is that a fair? Would you describe it that way, or is that helpful?
I think that is very helpful because in the case of fascism, for example, religious institutions do not necessarily disappear. They continue. Mussolini wanted to get along with the church, as did Franco. And the family, the role of the family is very significant, whereas in totalitarian movements, there's a tendency to turn children against their parents or to use one generation against another in order to build loyalty to the regime. Fascist regimes many times protect the family, the sanctity of the family. So yes, that's an excellent reminder, Roger.
Tomas, do you want to add anything to this question?
Yeah, I think along those lines, I think in Arendt's understanding, I think this is helpful. Totalitarian regimes really seek to transform human nature itself, right? What you mentioned as getting into people's apartments and homes and heads is a metaphor for that. And the camps were one of the most forceful institutions, as it were, to try to do that. And I think what is meant by this transformation of human nature itself is a total coordination to a certain ideology or worldview. And that the goal is to make the world consistent with a certain worldview, for example, a classless society, or for example, an Aryan society, with no restrictions, so that reality in a totalitarian regime would have to be whipped into shape, so to speak, completely according to a certain ideology, and different forms of violence and threat and so on are part of that. And the counter move to that, and I think this is so interesting about this book on totalitarianism by Arendt, is her insistence that the counter to that is to remember that you called it action before, that belonging to a political community, not the survival of one person is the resistance against totalitarianism, but the fact that one can belong to a political community in which a different kind, a non-coordinated, spontaneous kind of action and being leading a meaningful human life, being a human by being together with others. That's where, let's say, the beginning of a resistance or the beginning of a counter movement is situated.
At least it's separate. It's separate from that merging of society and the state. And there was a question that was conveyed to us from the audience about, how can one inoculate oneself against the danger of this kind of being merged into one monolithic whole of the state. And I think the answer is to keep up private relations spontaneously and without obedience to whatever, the mass culture of politics is telling you. I think to pursue life as before and to follow your personal rather than the socialized, and most highly recommended habits. There's a line, I had the quotation because I wrote it down, close to something that Seyla Benhabib said a moment ago about what totalitarianism could be characterized by. And this is a sentence from Arendt, from her part 3 on totalitarianism, that totalitarian movements constitute a lying world of consistency, which is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than reality itself. Something of her pessimism, if we can call it that, comes out there because, the human mind wants the world to be more consistent than it is. To the extent that you recognize the plurality of the world and that a lot of it disagrees with you and a lot of it disagrees with itself, you've built yourself some kind of inner, check against being seduced by the habits totalitarian government might want to instill. Seyla Benhabib said good things about fascism for definition. I just want to say authoritarianism is a very vague word. And I would caution against thinking that it has a sharp definition or that it helps much. The commercial democracies of the West, the old empires and the new one, the American empire, are now figuring the whole, battle of the next half century as something between what we call democracy and what we call authoritarianism. ism. That very allegory is a totalitarian help to thinking, and it doesn't really help thinking, it hinders it. There's authoritarian elements in good democracies, functioning democracies. Let's allow that ours was that, under COVID, and yet there was a necessary authoritarian streak in the orders given under COVID, and there's now some re-examination of that going on. The re-examination would never occur under totalitarian rule.
Yeah, thank you. The question that David was referencing in the chat came to us from Sasha McLean in Weston, Ontario. And as he said, the question was, what behaviors and practices inoculate individuals, families, and groups against ambient and rising totalitarian modes of culture and politics? And David mentioned one, right, which is, standing apart from the public in your private, in the family life, or amongst friends, I would assume he would include as well. Arendt actually frames this whole book in some sense to answer that question. She says in the preface, and then repeats again in the preface to part 1, that the book is an effort at what she calls comprehension, which she sometimes uses the word understanding. And she says, to comprehend is an attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. And that actually fits also with what David was just saying about the fact that propaganda and ideology create what Seyla and David have been talking about as a coherent fiction that is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than reality itself. And so a lot of the attempt in this book is to break through the coherent fiction and to do what Arendt often calls thinking, right? She in her last unfinished book, The Life of the Mind, she talks about, raises the question of whether thinking can be an inoculation against this kind of ideological, potentially totalitarian thinking. So we have this amazing book and a new edition of it. I thought I'd ask each of you to maybe pick 1 or 2 passages or quotes. Let's stick with one because we're short on time. I know that's hard to ask. I mean, we probably all have 50 of our favorite quotes from this book. But maybe Tomas, start with you. What's a favorite passage or line in this book that is that reminds you of the power of Arendt's thinking to resist and attentively face up to reality, whatever it may be, which might inoculate us against totalitarianism?
Well, you just read basically my favorite quote that I had prepared. And since I assumed this might happen, I prepared another one.
Sorry. Which one was it? Was it the comprehension one?
Yeah. So maybe I can read the one that you just singled out in its context about comprehension. Or I just want to, I mentioned something and then read another quote since we had the gist of it already. What is so interesting in this quotation that you mentioned, I think, that comprehension is the unpremeditated, attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. That reality is something here, I think, in a sentence to be resisted against, so to speak, in case of the Nazi crimes, for example. But even more so, reality resists explaining away, resists the coordination, as it were, with preconceived notions. And to give the shock of experience and the shock of reality the right that it has is key for Arendt because of the reasons we discussed before about what is it that stands against or can resist against totalitarianism. And that is that unexpected things can happen as long as people are not fully coordinated. In the concluding remarks, this first final chapter, she starts that by saying, we don't know the full implications of totalitarian rule, right? She says, okay, I wrote these 700 pages, but actually we don't really fully know what totalitarianism is because it is not fully in place. The brief quote that I would like to read to you is connected to that. And this is from the Reflections on the Hungarian Revolution. She says, events past and present, not social forces and historical trends, nor questionnaires and motivation research, nor any other gadgets of the arsenal of social sciences are the only reliable teachers of political scientists. So events are the teachers of political scientists. They are the most truthworthy source of information for those engaged in politics. Once such an event as the spontaneous uprising in Hungary has happened, every policy, theory, and forecast of future potentialities needs re-examination. In this light, we must check and enlarge our understanding of the totalitarian form of government, as well as of the nature of the totalitarian version of imperialism. So her focus on events in which spontaneous action crystallizes is very present in this book. As Seyla Benhabib said in the beginning, this book is not a theory of totalitarianism. It's not meant to be the checklist and you go down the list and then you know if a regime is totalitarian or not. I read it very much as an encouragement to look at the world and check if the vocabulary, if the words that we have actually match with that the shock that I experience in this moment, how this aligns or not, and that there is a constant going back and forth between the notions and the concepts and the language I have and what I see in reality, and hence this shape-shifting quality of the book, that she in each edition did change something in the book itself. It was not a stable thing for her to think about these new forms of rule.
Thank you. Yes. You know, and it's so important that for her, in many ways, the way to resist is critical thinking of some sort, is thinking deeply and pulling oneself out of just the way everyone else is thinking and the misapprehensions of reality. David, do you have a favorite passage or quote that we can talk about?
Yeah, I think I have one that's short enough. There are long ones about statelessness at the end of part 2 of Origins of Totalitarianism, which I'll recommend anyone who listens to your podcast or reads it on their own. Those are extraordinary paragraphs with a lot of paradoxical insight into the importance of nation-based rights as a kind of secure anchor for people who cannot get that from the general idea of human rights, which we'll never see enforced until there's an international cooperative community. So that's the passage that I'm not citing. But she has a very perceptive paragraph on, let's call it bureaucracy as government, and the way that the, so to speak, omnipotence of bureaucracy eliminates the check against abuse that is constituted by legality. In a funny way, though, nothing is more regular, nothing is more rule-like than bureaucracy. It operates, once it gets settled into a society, a mass society, perhaps a totalitarian society, it operates quite independent of law, partly because it's so large. It is secret, it is impersonal, and it is unaccountable. So with those things in mind, I mean, she says in her chapter on race and bureaucracy in part 2 of the Origins of Totalitarianism, at the basis of bureaucracy as a form of government and of its inherent replacement of law with temporary and changing decrees. And I would say this would be my present day analogy more than any other. The speed at which innovations take place, one after another, after another, after another, so that they are confusing and they leave everyone in a chaotic state of uncertainty. That's a precondition of totalitarian rule, but it can also be a symptom of deep craziness that we don't want to call necessarily totalitarian. In any case, when she says this about bureaucracy, its inherent replacement of law with temporary and changing decrees, lies this superstition of a possible and magic identification of man with the forces of history. The ideal of such a political body will always be the man behind the scenes who pulls the strings of history. Lord Cromer, in the heyday of the British Empire, finally shunned every written instrument or indeed anything which is tangible in his relationships with Egypt, even a proclamation or annexation, in order to be free to obey only the law of expansion, without obligation to a man-made treaty. Thus does the bureaucrat shun every general law, handling each situation separately by decree, because a law's inherent stability threatens to establish a permanent community in which nobody could possibly be a god, because all would have to obey a law. And that, I'll call it reverence, probably not the right word, but that extreme respect for law abidingness is a feature of Arendt's thinking, though she's not legalistic and lawyers are not for her the highest form of humanity. But legality is inconsistent with totalitarian or authoritarian government.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's an incredibly important passage and insight. I'll just add one thing because surprisingly, it hasn't been mentioned yet. As you said, that chapter is called Race and Bureaucracy. And the two forms of government in the 19th century that she thinks lead into totalitarianism are racist government as it's formed in South Africa and bureaucratic government as it's formed in some of the other colonies. And the connection is that bureaucracy is a responsibility that a certain elite group takes to rule over another group. And that is connected to racism. Interestingly enough, in her later work, Arendt says that the most dangerous form of elitism / racism in the modern world that threatens to undo the world is a kind of college-educated versus non-educated elitism that would lead to what she calls a new kind of racism based on intelligence rather than color or religion. I think that analysis of race and bureaucracy in chapters 6, 7, and 8 in this book are incredibly meaningful and apparent today.
Yeah, just a related thought from a thinker close to her generation. The idea that mass opinion is sort of soaked with propaganda, and that the more you are exposed to opinion, even what presents itself as a variety of opinions, as in the American mainstream media, the more sure you are that you are knowledgeable and well informed, but the more likely you are to be propagandized. And Jacques Ellul, in his book Propaganda, which I read recently, and it is a remarkable book published just 3 or 4 years after Origins of Totalitarianism, says that, paradoxical though it may seem, in an age of totalitarian propaganda, and he has in mind France under the Nazis in the 1940s, the person who is reasonably intelligent but has no exposure to the news at all is going to be more right about the way reality is than the person who is absolutely swamped by information that they're getting.
That sounds great. That sounds apparent. Seyla, do you have a favorite passage that you'd like to mention?
I do. I think the conversation is not going in places that I'm not quite sure would be so consonant with Arendt, because lawful lawlessness as opposed to legalism is a major category through which she tries to understand totalitarianism. And I think that instead of trying to see the way in which her category of race analysis would or would not fit contemporary circumstances, let's keep this in mind. Totalitarian regimes create forms of othering. And whether that is racial, religious, or based on other characteristics, othering will be there. Now, the passage that I want to focus on is the distinction between isolation and loneliness. And this is a little bit in answer to the question of the possibility of action. As you may recall, and loneliness is a tricky concept, and teaching this is very difficult because everybody thinks this is all about existential anxiety and we all feel lonely, etc. But she has a very quasi-technical sense understanding of loneliness, which is different than isolation. Isolation is our incapacity to act together. That is the impasse, she says, that we are driven into when the political sphere of our lives, where there is a common pursuit, is destroyed. And what's interesting about isolation is that, in effect, today you can be connected and isolated, right? I mean, this is one of the paradoxes of the electronic media. And, everybody thought that sort of the media would also mean electronic democracy. It turns out that we all know that it can perpetrate isolation. But loneliness for her is something that is more threatening, and it's deeper because it corresponds to the condition of being uprooted. That is, to have no place in the world, recognized and guaranteed by others, to be superfluous, not to belong to the world at all. Now, this is the extreme condition out of which mid-century totalitarianism arose, both as a result of wars, economic dislocation, inflation. It's an extreme condition, but it's an extreme condition to keep in mind. It's good to keep this in mind because it can be a kind of limit condition towards which societies can tend, right? Uprootedness and worldlessness, and the subtle distinction between isolation and loneliness, isolation being the inability to act together, and loneliness being this other much more radical question of worldlessness and uprootedness.
I think this reminder of this very subtle distinction between isolation and loneliness has a third part, and that is called solitude.
Right.
And brings us in a way full circle to what we talked about at the beginning, the distinction that Arendt makes between isolation, loneliness, and solitude, where solitude is the space in which I can be with myself and think about things. And once a totalitarian regime invades that, once I cannot be safe in my home, once I cannot even be safe in my own thoughts, we know that there were show trials under Stalin where people were were convicted for having dreams about killing Stalin, right? So in the moment where the solitude is invaded completely, or is also invaded, we have an additional attack on the human condition, as it were, to be with oneself before we can be with one another.
Yeah, a totalitarian government does not want to leave you alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're gonna move to a last question. And there are about 5 questions that ask this question in the chat. So it's one that I think a lot of people are asking about. I'll pick one from Connie Veldink from Linwood, Washington. And it's very simple. What kinds of resistance to totalitarianism does Arendt describe? How do we, there's another question by Steve Becker from Portland, Oregon. What breaks the hold of a totalitarian government? Under what conditions do they lose power? Interestingly enough, Seyla was talking about the camps, and, in the origins of totalitarianism in chapter 12, Arendt says that the camps are like holes of oblivion. Once you go in, nothing ever gets out. And, it's sort of like the end of all meaning and all spontaneity and etc. But then in Eichmann in Jerusalem, when she hears all the testimony of the survivors, she rephrases that and says the holes of oblivion do not exist.
Right.
So I'm wondering, and she does say, right, the spell dies when the leader dies often. And as soon as Stalin died and as soon as Hitler died, she thinks the totalitarian elements of these countries quickly dissipated. How does one, aside from the death of the leader, how does one resist, or how does totalitarianism end? Anyone want to jump in there? David, you laugh, so you get.
Well, I'll just say I let us concede, partly against Arendt's apparent thesis in this book, though she did not abide by it entirely in later writings, that, you know, the idea of totalitarianism as an absolute, as a walled up system that contains everyone in it, from which there is no breaking out, that has turned out not to be true. There have been terrible, long-lasting tyrannies throughout history that had as much control, domination over people as they wanted. And Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany were two recent examples when she was writing. But, you know, the loss in a war and a kind of, in the case of Nazi Germany, not just the death of the leader, and also the coming of new generations, new possibilities, changes in the world, changes even in leadership. Khrushchev built the subways for Stalin, but Khrushchev was the first person to begin to liberalize things under Soviet rule in you know, the early 60s. So it's very hard to predict, and so long as control is not complete and there are enough, you know, recalcitrant, somewhat intractable, pesty individuals here and there, and surveillance is not complete, the idea of totalitarianism is probably a limit condition that we're right to be cautious against. But, you know, not to scare ourselves and repeat day after day, well, when we're now in it, or we're seeing symptoms of it now. Like the word fascism, the word totalitarianism is capable of easy abuse. And I mean, right now, for example, the word fascist is thrown back and forth between the American left and the American right about each other. I know because I listen to both sides.
Yeah.
I like what David said at the beginning. I mean, look, even under Hitler's regime, there was the student group in Munich, the Weiße Rose, right? The White Rose, not to forget. There were the group of women, German women, who were married to Jewish men who protested in front of the Gestapo. There was Arendt herself, who was sitting in the Prussian State Library and noticing, you know, the anti-Semitic actions of professional organizations, about which a brilliant play was written by, not Berkowitz, but, you know, Roger, you can mention your wife's last name.
Well, Jenny Lynn Bader, my wife, who just sort of play Mrs. Stern wanders the Prussia State Library.
There were always elements, but also very important, I think, these regimes contain contradictions within themselves. And we see these contradictions in front of our eyes every day on television. But let's say in the case, again, to go back to the most extreme case, Germany, at one point, the generals in the army revolted against Hitler. And they revolted not because simply of the defeat, but there was also a sense of feudal, quasi-aristocratic military honor, right? And so all these major institutions can contain their own contradictions. And I know this from the case of Turkey. You know, there were many parts of the military that were not loyal to Erdogan. But these are contradictions in the regime. What we as citizens can do, not to forget something that Arendt emphasizes in her later writings, and that comes across also in the writings of Jonathan Schell, who was a great, I think, student of Arendt's, that is at some point massive collective disobedience.
Yes, and the Library of America just published a book on civil disobedience that is with Thoreau and Arendt's essays on those topics.
But Arendt also has the category which is less dramatic and less part of what she called the horizontal contract, but which it can matter. And she talks about it in a later essay called Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship. And dictatorship is much more common than totalitarianism. And that is non-support. Non-support. If you didn't salute with the mass of your classmates in a Nazi school, you were very unlikely to be punished. That's a fact. I know someone about whom that was true. And yet there was very, very little of that, as it were, just, I'm not part of this. And yet it can make a difference, a small difference, but a difference.
Well, I want to thank David Bromwich and Thomas Field and Seyla Benhabib for a incredibly enlightening conversation, for Max Rudin for organizing it, and encourage you all to go out and get the new edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism by Library of America. And again, if you want to join along and read it, the podcast Reading Hannah Arendt with Roger Berkowitz can take you through it chapter by chapter. Thank you all very much. Max, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was terrific. And thank you all really for a really terrific hour. Fascinating. You've been listening to Seyla Benhabib, Roger Berkowitz, David Bromwich, and Thomas Wild Field discuss Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, a new annotated edition co-edited by Thomas Field and underwritten by the Achilles and Bodman Foundation, will be published next month in the Library of America series, but you can order your copy now at LOA.org and receive it before it arrives on bookstore shelves. I hope you'll join us on Thursday, April 17th, as LOA Live continues its 2025 season with a conversation exploring the poetry of Sylvia Plath. We'll welcome acclaimed classicist Sarah Rudin, author of I Am the Arrow, The Life and Art of Sylvia Plath in 6 poems, forthcoming from Library of America later this month, along with Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Diane Seuss and Plath scholars Heather Clark and Amanda Golden. Details and links to register for LOA programs can be found on our website, LOA.org, where you'll also find information about the LOA volumes mentioned tonight and links to purchase those and volumes of other great American writing. LOA Live is made possible with support from Library of America members and viewers. We're grateful to everyone here tonight for joining us. LOA members receive special discounts, invitations to exclusive events, and other benefits while supporting Library of America's nonprofit mission. You can learn more at LOA.org/membership. Thanks so much again to our panelists for a really fascinating hour.